Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jared Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. Today's episode is a very special one for me. I am talking to the legendary Mr. Jeffery Keedy. Mr. Keedy is probably best known for his frequent contributions to Emigre, and his essays were always some of my favorite from the publication. But he is also a graphic designer, a type designer, and an educator. He's a graduate of Cranbrook, and since 1985 has been on the faculty at CalArts. His work has also been published in places like I and ID and the AIGA Journal. In this conversation, Mr. Keedy and I talk about his early interest in design and how he met Rudy Vanderlands, the editor and publisher of Emigre, and how Rudy got him to start writing for the magazine, how the design discourse has changed over the course of his career from the mid-'80s when design was still seen as commercial art and there really wasn't a discourse, through the 90s kind of surge in criticism and theory, into blogs and into our current discourse. We also talk about the differences between writing theory and criticism and about process, as well as this theory that he has that graphic design, as we often define it, is an invention of the 20th century that doesn't really exist anymore. It's a really interesting part of the conversation that really got me thinking about a lot of things in a different way. Like I said when I started reading design writing and discovered Emigre, Mr. Keedy quickly became one of my favorite writers. His writing was smart, it was witty, it was direct, and it was the type of design writing that I wanted more of. It was the type of design writing that I wanted to try to write, and it's still the type of writing that I'm very often drawn to. So I was so happy to spend this time to talk with him about his work and his writing, as well as the state of contemporary design criticism. He is truly a legend and a central voice in design criticism, so I don't want to waste any more time. This was a really fun one. Here is my conversation with the one and only Mr. Jeffery Keedy. I wanted to start talking to you because for a long time, up until, embarrassingly recently, I knew you only as a writer and had been reading your work for years. And I was curious about kind of in your background, what came first for you, design or writing?
Oh, design, definitely design. The writing actually came later. My interest was in design, not in writing, and I never had any ambition to be a writer. That was not a
really?
thing. Yeah. I never had any ambition, never any real training to be a writer either. And I don't consider myself a writer as such. No, not really.
Oh,
and I don't enjoy it either. I really don't.
You don't enjoy writing?
No.
So where did that...
I'd rather design. Much rather design.
So, okay. So where did the writing start for you then? Or where did that come in?
It came in from being sort of annoyed and bothered by things other designers, other writers were saying. I would see, for example, Stephen Heller would write something that was particularly wrong and didn't make sense. And I'm talking about all the way back like in the 80s, right? So then that would make me think, oh, geez, this. And then you'd commiserate with your friends and like, did you see, an AIGA Journal, what, Heller said about this or that, or someone else. But he's an easy target because he's so prolific and continues to be. And so we'd see that, and we'd all sort of say, yeah, that's so lame, blah, blah. But then I kind of felt like, and particularly once I started teaching, I felt like, well, I can't just like say, oh, that's lame and that's wrong. I have to answer back. I have to respond, basically, and say, wait a minute, you've got this wrong. Here's another way to think about it.
Okay.
And so all of the writing that I did, all 80s to the 90s, it was idea driven. It's because I had an idea and thoughts and sort of corrections to what I had already seen and read that I wanted to like get back out there, because it's like you don't get to just grumble and complain about some, people saying things,
Right.
that are wrong unless you sort of respond. So that was the impetus to write. Was usually I would see something that would just drive me crazy, and I think, oh,
Yeah.
that's so wrong, and that would sort of get me. And that's actually continued to be the case even sort of post Emigre. Like when I wrote the essay, The Global Style, that was the same thing. I'd been seeing it and hearing people talk about, this kind of work and everything, and it was just sort of like bothering me. And so I said, okay, I've got to write something for it. Of course, then since it was that, sort of post-Emigre, post-internet, the question is, oh, well, okay, fine, I want to write something, but where's it going to be published?
Right.
And because when I wrote The Global Style, I thought, oh, well, the perfect place for this really would be Slanted, because they're kind of like, in a way, perpetrators of much of this.
Yeah.
So, this is the perfect, location for that. So, because I come from and I had the sort of experience of, print, writing for print, now writing sort of, post-print, post-internet, there's this issue of who are you writing for?
Right.
And that's why after Emigre, for a long time, I didn't write much of anything, because it's like, well, who's my audience? I didn't really, for me, the going on and doing a blog and all that just felt like shouting down a well or something. I don't know. Who am I talking to? Who's listening? Who's even interested? And I was fortunate that with Emigre, I knew who my audience was. They knew who I was. If they were reading it and reading me, they were reading it for a particular, they knew what they were getting into. And it was, back then, it was a dialogue and a conversation, an ongoing thing that was happening. But post Emigre, it was very different. There were fewer places to publish in, and the question was always, who am I talking to and why would I do it? So now every once in a while there's something that I want to write, but then the first big issue is like, well, where who am I writing to? Where do I publish it?
So was Emigre the first place that you started publishing your writing?
No, I think probably the first place I was writing where, again, this is, there sort of is the internet, but people weren't using it for that so much. Right. It would be like AIGA Journal.
Oh, okay.
And things like that, very small. And like there was a Los Angeles AIGA Journal. Like, for example, I think when MoCA, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, was here and was designed, and they hired, who did they hire to do the logo? I think it was Pentagram, to do their logo and identity, whatever. I would like go on there and write, about that. And like, oh, thank God you didn't, hire anyone from Los Angeles to design this.
Right.
So things like I think probably started writing there first, but Rudy got interested in me, and I started writing for Emigre because of the typeface in my design. He was interested in my typefaces in my design, not in my writing.
Oh, interesting. Okay. I'm trying to think of the best way to phrase this. So how did that relationship, because I was curious about kind of how you got connected to Emigre, because so much of the writing I've read of you is from that, and in my mind you're very much connected to the Emigre kind of group of writers. How did you become a writer for that?
It started with, my connection with Rudy started with, let's see, I think his first issue of Emigre came out, I'm thinking, I think I was just graduating, I was at Cranbrook and just getting out, and so I'd seen, the first sort of couple of issues, then I came out to LA, I was here, and it was actually, we did the at CalArts, we did a tour of San Francisco. So we took the students up and we went to a bunch of studios and galleries and, like a field trip kind of thing. And of course, we went to Emigre. So we went to Emigre and we looked at their work and sort of talked to them and all that. And then that's when Rudy, said, well, let me see some of your stuff. And he kind of got familiar with my work. Turns out he'd actually seen some of it before. And he wanted to, when he saw my work and he saw my typefaces in it.
Okay.
And so they were just starting a typeface business, right? And so he's like, hey, why don't you give me some of your, typefaces and I'll sell them through Emigre? And I'm like, no, I'm not interested in that. But that's where kind of the connection started. But then he persisted and said, no, you should really sell your typeface with us. And so I finally said, okay. And then my then studio mate, Ed Fellows, said, yeah, but you got to change the name. The name's dumb. So, and he said, well, you got to call it Keedy Sands because, Gil Sands and all that. Right. And if you don't, everyone's going to think Susanna Lichko designed it because at that time she designed all their typefaces.
Right.
So you got to call it Keedy Sands. And so I always listened to my elders. And I said, okay, Ed, I'll change it. Keedy Sands it is. And so that's how that whole thing started. So in doing that, I think, I'm talking to Rudy and Susanna. We sort of got to know each other and they saw more of my work. And then they interviewed me along with a whole bunch of other, people and what's going on. And then Rudy and I would talk and this and that. And I forget what I think the first thing probably that was published by me and Emigre was probably just an interview I did with Rudy.
Okay.
And had a conversation, just like we're doing now. He just said, and that was his early format, was always interview.
Yeah.
And so he did an interview with me, and then I don't know, something out of that, something came up that he wanted to write and publish. I think the other thing that maybe people don't realize, though, a lot of those essays in Emigre that were written up, those were lectures that I gave. So those essays were lectures that I gave, in Europe and the U.S. and various places. Several of them were lectures I gave at Cooper.
Okay.
So if you check the little tiny print at the bottom, a lot of them would be. So I'd be working on a lecture that I was gonna give somewhere, and then I would write that up as a text essay. And so I publish the essay, and then I would give the lecture.
Oh, interesting. So were you? This is kind of my last question, just to kind of wrap up the kind of personal history. I'm just trying to piece some things together. So how did you? And this is a bit of a multi-part question. When you graduated from Cranbrook, did you know that you wanted to teach, or kind of how did you get connected to CalArts? Because it sounds like so much of your writing actually came out of being a teacher and lectures and things. So where did that kind of interest come from?
Well, yeah, the writing. I think actually if you are a teacher, you should write, and you kind of have to, because it's sort of your job. That's why they're called academics, I think.
Right.
I'm annoyed by how many academics there are that don't write and don't lecture and basically don't do anything but teach.
Yeah.
And so to me, they're not doing their job.
Right.
Their job is actually to help make the culture of design. Well, they're not doing their job, and they haven't for a long time, and that's why there is no culture of design anymore.
Right.
Because we've got a bunch of lazy faculty, essentially.
Yeah. So did you want to be a teacher, or how did you start teaching?
Yeah, very, very, very early. I have to go all the way back to the 80s. In the 80s, in my undergrad, I went to Western Michigan University, which is in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and I just went there because that's where I lived. I lived in the Midwest in Battle Creek, Michigan.
Okay.
and I couldn't afford to go too far because I had no money. So, but I went to Western, and as it turns out, I was very lucky because they had a really good design program. I actually went in art, sort of generally kind of went into art. Then art was like a big blanket sort of thing in a lot of universities. And I wanted a university education. So, but when I was at Western, it turned out to be a really, really good program. I had a really good instructor there. His name's Bruce Naftel. And I was very kind of impressed by him. And he built this thing in the school called they had a design office and everything. So even though I was in art and doing drawing and painting and all that, and actually photography, just seeing design, I thought, hey, these people really have their shit together. Whereas the artists, not so much.
Right.
So I segued into design, and I think it was, even as an undergrad, just seeing Bruce, how he organized the thing and taught and all that, and I thought that's really cool. I would kind of, maybe at some point, maybe when I'm old, maybe I'll teach. That was what I was thinking as undergrad, because teachers are kind of old. So I liked that idea, and also I had, there was the necessity to make money. So even though I kind of was interested in art and wanted to be an artist, I knew it's like, I can't make a living doing that, or it's like, I can wait tables by day and make paintings in the attic by night. I didn't want that lifestyle, so I thought, okay, design kind of makes sense. So my undergraduate degree from Western was, I had a dual major. I had a BFA in graphic design and photography, and then I, as a major, and then as a minor, I had a philosophy minor.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So I was interested in ideas, right?
Yeah.
And stuff like that. But then I was interested in art, but I had the necessity of making a living. So like so many other people who were, have a sort of creative interest but don't want to be an artist I didn't want to be in the art world either. I mean, my exposure to that made it clear to me that I had no interest in fine art in the art world.
Yeah.
Because it's very problematic on a number of levels. So very, very, so even from my undergrad, having really good undergrad teachers like Bruce Naftel and Janie Moore was another great undergrad teacher. And then I had good Dick Kevaney. He was an artist, an art teacher, but he taught art history at the time. There was, of course, no such thing as design history, but he was extremely sympathetic to design and designers, and he tried to incorporate that into his art history. So I kind of lucked out. It was a very good undergrad experience, and I think those sort of shaped my idea. While I had just gotten graduated, and I went with Bruce Naftel and my then, girlfriend, who's also in the design program. We made a trip and we visited Cranbrook because Wolfgang Weingart was lecturing there.
Oh wow!
And I was a huge Wolfgang fan. I did my major, one of my major sort of undergrad design projects was this poster about Wolfgang Weingart, and I just thought he was like the coolest. So Bruce knew that, and he heard that Wolfgang was like one of Wolfgang's first trips to the U.S. was stopping at Cranbrook and giving a lecture. Oh wow! So as an undergrad, I went and visited Cranbrook to see Wolfgang.
Yeah.
That's how I also first learned about Cranbrook, and I got to see my hero, Wolfgang Weingart. So, yeah, that's how those things.
Wow. That's actually kind of amazing and kind of funny. I just picture you being, kind of 1920, being a Wolfgang Weingart, just like super fan, traveling to go see him talk.
I was a super fan.
Yeah.
Then he hit on my girlfriend.
Oh no.
Yeah, it's like when your hero, like,
yeah,
it's on your girlfriend. It's like,
wow,
yeah. But it's the '80s. That's what teachers did back then. It was,
right.
It was a different time. It was kind of expected. You were like the famous European designer traveling, visiting the school. So
yeah, I'm curious though. I know I said that last question was my last kind of question about your background, but I'm curious about that minor in philosophy. and you saying you were interested in ideas. Were you at the time seeing any connection between kind of the things you were reading in your philosophy classes with the design work that you were studying?
Not really.
Okay.
No. That was at that time, we're talking about in the 80s. No, that was been too big of a leap at that point.
Okay. Did that ever come back together for you?
Yeah, but much later.
Okay.
Much later than that. It was. But at that time, it was. Graphic design was. It's something you did for clients. There was a very specific idea of what design was, and
Right.
it was now, because of, I have to say, thanks to people like me, we have our autonomy, and it's seen as cultural practice and all that.
Yeah.
But certainly when I was in my undergrad, that none of that was the case. That, in fact, it was the opposite. You had people like Massimo Vanelli or Paul Rand or whoever saying, design is not art, and there's a clear demarcation, and blah blah
Right.
blah, and design is, so that way you have to understand that way of thinking just did not exist and hadn't existed in design. So that would have been too big of a leap.
Well, yeah, I mean, and that's exactly why I was curious, because as somebody who came to design basically post Emigre, post 90s critical theory boom.
Yeah, once everything was allowed, lucky
Right.
you.
Right. So I was curious kind of what that was like for you as someone who was working pre that, and then to experience that and to be a part of that discourse. It's easy for me to look back at that time, and I've said this to multiple people with kind of rose-tinted glasses. It's like, oh, that's the best time for design criticism. What are your thoughts on that? On kind of working before that?
It actually was a cool time, and it was a real moment, because a whole bunch of factors, a whole bunch of things happened and came together. And of course, at the time, I didn't quite realize it. After my undergrad experience and just going into Cranbrook, that would still be early to mid 80s. I thought, oh God, I live in such a crappy time. This is such an uninteresting moment that I had to be born in. And I just thought it was like not an interesting time in the early 80s. I quickly kind of figured out, roughly about just after graduating Cranbrook, and then by then the computers came along, internet, blah, blah, blah. By then I kind of got, oh no, wait, this actually is an interesting time. And it's an interesting time for design. That I was wrong. Because I was thinking, I was like, when I went into Cranbrook and looking at design history and everything, I thought, oh, mid-century, that was so cool. Mid-century modernism was so cool. Like, they had modernism, the Europeans laid down modernism in the 20s, and et cetera. But then the mid-century American modernists came along and said, yeah, your modernism's cool, but we want to have fun, and we want to have ideas and do more interesting stuff. And I would think, yeah, that was it. The mid-century, that was like so cool. And then I thought, but 80s is so not cool, because it was, we were surviving off of what basically had wrought in the 70s, which was the professionalization of graphic design,
Right.
The international style, corporate modernism, Massimo Vanelli on one hand, Milton Glaser on the other. And so like, that's what design was. And so me in the 80s looking, I'm like, ugh, this is not, is not anywhere near as fun as the mid-century modernists were. And oh, boo-hoo, poor me, and why did I have to be born in the age of sort of commercial modernism, where you can be either an international faux European modernist, or you can be, a folksy nostalgia, Americana kind of design. Like Milton. So those were sort of the choice, and it just seemed like, ugh, this is really not cool at the time. But like I say, by the time, once it hit like the 90s, then things really picked up, and I kind of realized, oh wait, maybe this is an interesting time, and there are possibilities, and and then also I was engaged in creating with Lorraine Wow, in creating a program and an idea about design at that point, and we were into it, and so and we did realize, this is actually an interesting time.
And how did that discourse and that kind of wide-ranging theory and writing that was happening, did that change kind of how you were approaching your design work and how you thought about what you did?
Yeah, that changed actually while I was at Cranbrook, because
Okay.
when I was at Cranbrook, like I say, I was interested in ideas, and that's when it didn't happen in undergrad at all. And then I actually, after undergrad, I worked for a couple of years as a designer.
Okay.
And then I went to Cranbrook to escape that, but also because I always knew that I wanted to teach at some point, and you had to have a master's degree to teach. And I, because of the Vanguard experience, I knew about Cranbrook, and I thought that was like probably the school for me to go to.
Mm-hmm.
And there also back then, if you wanted to be an MFA, it's not like now. There weren't a million choices.
Right.
There was a handful of choices, and I only applied to like Cranbrook, and then oddly enough, I applied to Kent State. They had an interesting design program, and I had gone there after undergrad to do a workshop with April Greiman, because she was the other cool designer at the time. Yeah. So I did a workshop at there that they had over the summer during their summer school, and it was with April Greiman and Jamie Odgers, and then Rick Felicenti of Thirst, I think.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So, and that's where I sort of met them and hung out with them a bit, and little did I know that it would be sort of a precursor to me eventually making it to the West Coast. But yeah, that was just sort of the beginning of that. So all these things happened bit by bit. There was not, in hindsight, it gets abbreviated and simplified. And,
of course.
Things are not as simple as they appear, and there's a lot of overlap. But I started my interest in theory. So as an MFA, I'm studying at Cranbrook, and I'm interested in theory and ideas. And so that meant back then that would be like, looking at issues of visible language. Mm-hmm. And really there was very little. And for theory back then, it was really, like rhetoric. Tom Ockersey at RISD was doing this stuff about rhetoric and stuff like that. But I just thought, this is not happening. Design theory is like nothing, But then by contrast, what was at the time happening in all the sort of schools and universities was the whole critical theory thing, right? Was happening. And the invasion of the French, and those ideas. And so I would go over to Ann Arbor to Borders Books, back when Borders was only one bookstore, a bookstore in Ann Arbor. And Borders Books was a huge, great bookstore. And that was a place where you could get books by Roland Barthes and Derrida, and you can get your Lacan there and all that other sort of stuff. Right. And that was also culturally in the air too. These sort of ideas, postmodernism was cranking up at the time. So all of those ideas were there, and it's like, well, look, everyone else is being interesting and smart. Why can't graphic designers? So that was the beginning of figuring that out and starting to talk more and more about theory. Also at Cranbrook, when I was at Cranbrook, the architecture faculty was Daniel Libeskind.
Oh,
and
wow.
He's a postmodernist and a theorist. And just before I'd gotten there, he had edited an entire issue of Visible Language, and it was French Currents of the Letter. It was all about French, theory, philosophy, and language studies and all of that. So he had done that in collaboration with the design program, and he'd given lectures, and he was very inspiring, and he brought people like Zaha Hadid and Alto and people like that. And so architecture was very much into theory and also this is at a time when there was the paper architects. So there wasn't work for architects, so they were doing theoretical work, and then they were doing these incredible drawings, which were a kind of physical embodiment of all these sort of abstract theories and ideas and everything. And so that, of course, was great and inspiring to see, the work of Libeskind and Zaha Hadid and, people like that. My first year, my roommate was Hani Rashid, who's the designer. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the Canadian, and he brought his brother. His brother came, to visit, and his brother was like this wacky industrial designer that was doing new stuff. So that was, even though I was in Michigan, in the sort of backwater, there was plenty of exposure to a lot of interesting ideas and things, and it was a very, very particularly mid to late 80s was a very culturally interesting time, and all this stuff is going on, and I'm seeing all this, like, it's really cool, it's interesting, but then I'm looking at graphic design and going, what? It's like, this is not happening in graphic design, and it made no sense to me, because I said it should be, if anywhere, it should be happening in design. That's a kind of nexus of all these things, of language and vision, and like why on earth aren't designers getting with this? And a big part of the reason why, and the problem was, design was this commercial practice, right? It was this, and this big, these kind of abstract ideas and theory and all that seemed, designers would say, no, that's the province of art, and that's not for us, that's, so that was a bit of why back then it was sort of, this battle. It wasn't, the autonomy was part of that autonomy was for us to be able to think more interesting thoughts, not just to like do whatever we wanted to do.
Right. I'm curious. I kind of want to step back a little bit, and I'm curious kind of about the kind of going off of that. I'm curious about the sort of end of Emigre and then the kind of loss of interest in that theory. And that's kind of, when I kind of came into all of this. And I'm curious about how that discourse has changed over the course of your career.
When you look at this stuff in hindsight, is this big kind of, battle. But the other thing that's thrown into it is technology. It also became generational, because you have the sort of older professionals, and then you have the young MFAs.
Right.
MFA education is also the thing that clicked in and started happening. Now more and more programs are having MFAs, and there's this new thing, the MFA, and what does that mean? And so that fed into it also. So, and then, like I say, in the technology, so you had all these different things, and that created like a perfect storm of kind of interesting possibilities and upheaval and, all that. And so that's why when you look back into that stuff of the 90s, you see all of this and go, wow, things were really, and that's what it was. It was sorting all of that out, basically. And it was an interesting time and a fun time that just happened once. You missed it. Sorry.
Yeah.
It was fun.
Yeah. Well, I was gonna ask, do you think that type of conversation is even possible anymore?
No, it's because design is a different thing now, and everything's, it's like, the circumstances are different. I like that saying, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes.
Yeah.
So I don't see the set of extenuating circumstances happening in the same way. And also, design transformed itself into something else. So I don't see that really happening the same way, or maybe happening at all.
Yeah, because as you were talking about that, I was thinking about that transformation of design and how it's almost gotten so big, and graphic design spans everything from, kind of the classic logo to interfaces on apps, that it's almost so siloed that there isn't a place for something where all that comes together. And then on top of that, there's sort of a general wider consciousness that people understand design.
Well, that's why when you look back and you read all those things of, in Emigre, there was a we. You see, there's no we now.
Right.
And also there was something at stake. There was like one group, the sort of international style modernists, commercial modernists, the sort of Massimo Vanellis who'd like struggled to make design professional. That generation, their whole thing was to professionalize design. So they had the Aspen Design Conference, and
Right.
tried to explain to business, look, design is, important, for business, and it's not just making things look better and blah, blah, blah. So there was this whole group of generation that worked very hard to sort of professionalize design. They saw this, these new MFAs coming out and basically taking a wrecking ball to everything, deprofessionalizing, letting the messiness of art in, and et cetera, et cetera. And so, and there was still a kind of we there. And so there seemed like there was something at stake. There was something, that we were all fighting for who was right and who had the best idea about what design would be, but instead of something, well, since I guess I would say, having been one of the people that fought for kind of autonomy, it's like, I got it, but then, we got autonomy, but then it's like the gods punishing you by giving you what you want. It's like, okay, well, now we have this autonomy. What are we going to do with it? And I find out what we're going to do with it is we're going to make zines about our cat.
Right.
That's what we're going to do with it. And it's going to be a risograph, and we're going to exchange it with our friends.
Yeah. Well, I mean, because I was even thinking about that autonomy when you were talking about that, and I was thinking about your global style piece, that it's also, there's now this kind of whole field in graphic design, and it comes back to what you were talking about being at Cranbrook and seeing paper architecture, that there's this speculative design that is sometimes called, critical design, that almost, has swung completely to that other direction.
It has and it hasn't. See, the thing that architecture has that design doesn't is, well, first of all, it's got a much longer history.
Right.
And it's also, there's a license, there's a professionalization of it, and there's organizations that kind of monitor the field of it, which we don't have. And there's a level of academic rigor that we also don't have.
Right.
So there are all these other things in place that demanded a pretty high level of competency in the work. Now, by contrast with design, you talk about speculative design or so-called critical, which it should be called not critical design.
Right.
Would be the real title for that. Is the problem is that there's no rigor there, and there's no, it literally is anything. It's whatever the hell you say it is.
Yeah.
That's what. So, and that I find completely uninteresting.
Well, yeah. Yeah, I mean, and that's something that I feel like your global style piece, I don't mean to keep coming back to that, really hit on in something that I've been thinking about a lot with this, quote unquote critical design, is that it all looks the same. And now if a designer wants to be seen as a critical designer, they just use that aesthetic and now they're a critical designer. You know what I mean?
But that's just art style. That started way back. That was like already in the 90s, and it got solidified from 2000 on. There's an aesthetic of the art world, and that's what that is. It's that aesthetic. It's the thing that you make art catalogs and art posters and this and that. And art loved modernism because modernism's obedient and it's transparent, right, and all that jazz, so that it can be about the art. And so this is just the latest iteration of that. It's the sort of official art style that's now they call it critical, or it'll have whatever new name it needs, but basically it's a kind of obedient modernist transparency, and it's easy to do, and it's fast, so that's why it's all over the world, so if you have an exhibition in Fiji, I already know what it's going to look like, what the catalog will look like. A sans serif typeface, and it'll have
how
it's a thing.
I'm curious how you, I don't want to say fight against that, but basically, how do you fight against that as a teacher I have a little experience teaching, and I had an opportunity to critique undergrad senior theses recently, and I was surprised at how many students would start with kind of these big ideas about something that they wanted to explore through design, and then through their presentation, when I saw the finished product or finished project or whatever the thing was that they made, it just kind of fell into these predefined styles and seemed to have no relation to that idea. How do you think about that in a classroom setting? Do you see that?
Well, that's always been the case, and that never goes away, that disconnect between sort of the ideas and the theory and the thing that's made, that disjunction. I always think of the classic example of that is all the way back in the early days of modernism. If you read like text by Piet Zwart, trained as an architect, and he talks about all the rationality and functionality and this and blah, 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 and then you look at his work and it's like, what? And he does this totally crazy looking, nuts, so extremely personal stuff. But then all of his writing, all the jargon is, this and that. Massimo was another one who, towed the modernist line, only 5 typefaces,
right.
All these rules. And yet this stuff ends up looking basically like the way they want it to look, Right. So there's always a disjunction between, the theory and what people say, and then how the thing looks. And the irony is, of course, with modernism, the modernist idea is this whole, form follows function, or what, people use that
right.
misquote of Louis Sullivan. But it's interpreted to mean that the forms derive their form from the ideas. You have an idea, you have a concept, and then that's what is the engine that drives the form. That's sort of how it's supposed to be. But yet it's like, well, you all have a zillion different ideas, and yet the forms all end up looking the same. So we know that's not true. That's not actually what's happening. That's not, and it hasn't been. It's never been. There's always been that disconnect. I thought actually when it was trying to be connected was actually in the 90s, when you had all this postmodern sort of deconstructive work, and everyone was like, oh, this work is like a nightmare, and layering, and it's hard to read, and this and that. But I was like, well, actually, but guess what? It was sort of connected to ideas, and you could see it and you could trace it. So there was a brief moment when it kind of was starting to happen, but it scared people, and so it went away. We're back to good old modernism.
I want to change gears a little bit. Do you see the work that you're writing? Do you think of that as criticism?
Well, some of it is, but not all of it is. When I first think of like theory as the overall category. So within theory, there's methodology. That's, I have it in 3 parts. Methodology, which is people now refer to process. It means how you do something.
Yeah.
And process can be literally the, like a YouTube tutorial about how to use some software. That's like a process, or it can be the process of how you analyze and think about ideas and break down a course of action or whatever. So there's sort of process and how to is one section. Then there's the criticality, which is once something is done, or if you're thinking about doing something, how do you think about it critically to have a course of action that would then drive that methodology, because process is just how you do something, but methodology is your plan to instigate how you do something, and it's like science. You have a theory, and you have an idea of what you're doing and what the possible outcomes are, and et cetera, et cetera. And then there's pure theory, which is just like philosophy. It's more, it's just pure thinking and pure, a theory of ideas and that sense. So there's like those, to me, there's like those 3 camps, and they're a little bit mixed. One goes here and one goes there, but critical writing and critical theory is just one. The other is all about process and methodology. That's another whole section, and then pure theory is the other. So they tend to get mixed, and people tend to use, big words like, criticism or theory or whatever, and you don't always know which one they're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I asked, is because I've been trying to, just for myself, better articulate those differences between. And so I was curious kind of how you thought about the writing that you do.
Well, I break it down into those three groups. When I started teaching theory actually at CalArts. Well, it was 2001, I think, when I started the first, and I taught a couple of different theory classes for about a decade or so. Actually, before that, the very first theory course I taught was Sheila de Bretteville hired me to teach theory at Otis.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was one class, and it was kind of it was crazy teaching theory to a bunch of people who did not want it. But it was interesting because she said, "No, let's try this. I want you to sort of articulate what's going on now in the world, and put together a sort of reading list that would be accessible." And yeah, that was interesting. It wasn't 100% successful. I think most of the students hated it. And then it took me a few years, and it was like in 2001 is when I started a couple of theory courses at CalArts, and I eventually broke it into two theory courses, Theory 1, Theory 2. So Theory 1 was just a history of theories. So it was basically readings starting with Ruskin, going from Ruskin to Emigre, basically.
Oh, wow.
So it was an overview and a history of theories. So that was that. And then Theory 2 was all contemporary, was like what people are saying and writing about now. And so those were the sort of two theory courses.
Oh, that sounds great, actually.
Yeah. Oh, you missed it. I did that for about 10 years or so. And we have a theory course now, which Louise, you talked to Louise.
Yep.
Louise Sandhaus teaches theory now.
Okay.
And so she teaches a theory course, but she does it, it's, of course, we've been, doing it for a couple decades. So it's evolved over time, and it's become, as things do, a very different thing. But one problem with design theory is, and the Looking Closer series kind of tried to address that, is you really do have to have, to some extent, you have to establish a little bit of a canon or something. Yeah. So you have a vocabulary and that you can use to have a conversation. You can't just sit down with a bunch of designers and say, okay, let's talk theory.
Right. Right.
That doesn't work. So it unfortunately requires a degree of literacy that very few people have.
Well, and that was what I was wanting to ask you next. Actually, was and we talked a little bit before we started recording about this, but there seems to be, this is a blanket statement, but there seems to be this kind of general not interest in theory in the design community, or a certain anti-intellectualism, for lack of a better word. And I'm curious, two questions. One, why do you think that is? And then what value a theoretical discourse could and can bring to the design profession?
Well, I would say first that lack of criticality, or the sort of anti-intellectual, that's not specific to graphic design. That's everybody, Jared.
Right.
And also, newsflash, people aren't terribly smart either, in general.
Yeah.
So that's not at all specific to design. So that's
okay.
the
right.
Are you aware of the president we have?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
so. Yeah. That's not a design. It's not a design problem.
That is a very good point. Actually,
it's a problem of human beings.
Yeah,
that's what that problem is. The other question, which is about so is it of use and value, or something important to design? I would say it is, if it is to you. See, that's the problem. So, but to a lot of people, it isn't. And there are some people that it is important and that it is of value to.
Right.
But then, and then also that connects and speaks to a larger thing of if there is such a thing as a we, or a
Right.
design culture, then it obviously would be important to that. But there's a big question now as to whether there really is a we or there is a design culture as such.
Do you think that there's a value then in? I'm kind of flipping the question a little bit because we've been talking a lot about this writing and this discourse as a sort of inside baseball kind of by and for designers. Do you think there's value in having a graphic design critic, for example, at the New York Times? Having something that's kind of outward looking that's talking about these things?
Well, yeah, I mean, we're maybe late to get it.
Yeah.
There's, in Europe, they've had, popular press, about design and design, and they talk about it, right? Gerard Unger for years wrote a newspaper column about typefaces.
Right.
In the newspaper, and they're really interesting and really clever, but obviously very sort of accessible. But it was all just about typefaces and type design. It was just for the newspaper. So yeah, there's definitely a place for that. But I also think designers have to insist on it. For years, whenever we would see something like in the New York Times or somewhere, someone would mention like, they would write on and on and on about some book and say, and the design is really interesting, it's fabulous, blah, 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 and never mention who the designer was.
Right.
That would be typical for you. Now, at least we've gotten past that, and most people realize if you talk about design, it's authored, that a designer actually did it. So we're kind of past that hump, but just barely past that. I keep seeing tons of anonymous sort of design everywhere, and people talking about design in really anonymous terms. So I'm not sure how far we've come from that, but it would really require an insistence on the part of the designers that design is talked about in a more interesting and responsible way. I mean, people don't write about architecture that way, and they don't because architects wouldn't let them.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that leads into perfectly my next question, which is I just have a couple questions to kind of just wrap everything up. But what you just said leads into, this is a question that I've asked everybody. And it's kind of, what are the subjects that design critics should be writing about right now, or design theorists should be writing about? What are the big issues in graphic design right now that maybe are under-theorized or need to have a spotlight turned to them?
Well, I think the first thing is that people, keep doing it and try and do it well, and not just do tweets and Instagram or whatever. Right. That they actually, first it requires the activity, the engagement, whether it's written or it's, podcast or whatever it is. But as far as, the ideas or the subject, I actually think that disciplinarity is the key issue, as being, and having seen us go from being an overly conscripted sort of practice and discipline to one of the exact opposite now, where, literally, you're a graphic designer if you design a risograph zine or a 400-page catalog for or, whoever, and both of those things are graphic designers. And you're also a graphic designer if you do UI, UX, or whatever, So it's just become so big that it's hard to have a very sensible conversation about it. So I think a big issue is kind of disciplinary, a disciplinary issue, and like, what is the design discipline, and what are we talking about when we talk about design? Right. Because since it's gotten so big, people don't know what they're talking about anymore, and it's just too. So I think also the issue of in the art world, for example, there's there's paintings at the local art fair, watercolors, like my mom does, and and they sit under an umbrella and sell them. And then there's also Damien Hirst art, right, and showing it, the big show he's just opening. So there's different levels of art and art practice. There's different levels of literature and literature practice. Yeah. There's kind of only one level of design practice. It's all kind of exists in this kind of middle brow, everywhere, everything. There are different practices of architecture. There's the architects that are sort of local and do your homes and do business and this and that. And then there's, the Frank Gehry's and the Morphosists and Zaha Hadid and all that. So that operates at very, very different levels. And they have their own level of discourse. Graphic design hasn't done that, hasn't differentiated itself into these different groups or levels. So we're kind of stuck being populist and being everything to everyone, and so there's kind of I think there has to be some disciplinarity in order to get out of that. There has to be, if there's going to be a kind of, for people who are interested in having a kind of smart conversation about design, it's obviously going to be a smaller group, but the terms have to be defined, and it has to exist somewhere. And that's, they're, basically the a kind of high end or an elite aspect to design, which kind of, for a lot of people, it's like, well, but that's not what design is, right? That flies in the face of design, that design is pop and populist, and certainly a lot of designers, that's why they like design, and they have no interest in a kind of more rarefied practice or way of thinking of design. They're just not interested in that, So the first thing I would say is sort of disciplinarity is right now it's just kind of a mess. So even when you see things like the Design Observer, trying to kind of negotiate that, it's very confusing because you're never quite sure where you're standing. Right. In that. And so I think, for me, that is the big question. And in a way, it's the failing of academia, because, that kind of level of discourse and the high end and all that, it's the job of academia to create that space, and they didn't do it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting. I found a lot of the people that end up listening to these are educators or academics, and I think I don't want to speak for them, but I think part of it is that sense also, that sense that we need some of that differentiation a little bit.
Well, there was a brief moment where that's what kind of the Emigre kind of did, which was interesting, but it was a commercial vehicle, a commercial business or practice that set up that space for that conversation, as briefly as it happened. Yeah. I think people hoped and people wanted ... to be it next, to be the next thing, but it didn't really work out that way. At least I didn't think it worked out that way. Yeah. And also didn't last that long either. And I just remember, Rudy and I at the end were all saying, well, we wonder what will be next, or who will, fill this void or whatever. And instead it just kind of disappeared, right?
Yeah. I mean, and that's something, that was the other thing I was curious about is how much do you keep up with a kind of current design discourse? Are there places that you're turning for this kind of thing, or does it just not really exist for you anymore?
I find bits and pieces here and there, but it's kind of random, and it's people, writing and having thoughts in all these sort of disparate places, and there are also different kind of practices that, because the other thing that's happened is design has really changed and become something else. At that time, it was much easier to talk about design with a capital D, because it was primarily print design, and everybody knew that. And design practice hadn't changed for about 100 years, but after that, it all changed. The graphic design that Dwiggins was talking about kind of doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
And he coined the term, and because so many things happened, that graphic design was separate from marketing and advertising. Well, sort of marketing, advertising, commercial art kind of incorporated itself into design, or I would say swallowed it up. So that, like when I studied and started to be a graphic designer after my undergrad, I wasn't at all interested in advertising. And we saw advertising and all of that as a completely different discipline.
Yeah.
By the time we get to, like, say, M & Company, where you see Tibor Kalman, like, with a foot in both sides, doing sort of design, but also doing advertising, or, say, Durant Doyle Partners, or people like, there was this sort of moment where it started to switch over. Now everything's totally integrated. There is no, with branding is the ultimate integration of advertising into design. So there's no separation, and now there's no separation in the media, and you just see this thing. That's a different thing than that thing Dwiggins was talking about. It's become something else. So I really think of graphic design as essentially a 20th century phenomena. It's something that happened in the 20th century. But this thing we do now, we still call it graphic design. In the 21st century, we still call it graphic design. I think it's something else. Yeah, it's also this thing of design moving from, in the 20th century, design was essentially concerned with objects, with made things.
Right.
In the 21st century, not so much, and all these other aspects, and so yeah, I think graphic design ended with the 20th century.
That's
We're doing something else.
I mean, that's so interesting. I'm so mad that you bring this up right at the end of our conversation, because I could talk to you about
it. It's a great place to end. Design is over.
Right. I do have one final question for you that's completely different, and I'm just curious, maybe outside of the design world, who are the writers or the critics? Are there people that have really influenced the way you think about design or the way you think about your own writing?
Yeah, that's kind of hard, because there's a ton of people who've influenced me and who I think about, and, some of them very direct. Of course, my colleagues, Ed and Lorraine, always had a huge influence on my thinking. Ed Fell and Lorraine Wild, in case you don't know. So there's, people, the sort of real people, all the tons of sort of colleagues and students, on a kind of real level. In terms of theoretical and reading, it's going to sound terrible. I'm a fan of Nietzsche.
Okay.
Yeah. No way. That's I shouldn't have even said it. That's going to do me in. Okay, but this, from way back, from sort of the old days of first studying philosophy, and that still kind of holds true. And of course, Roland Barthes was a huge influence to me, because that was basically this mashup between culture and philosophy, right, and language. You got culture, philosophy, language, and all the things I love, kind of all rolled up and done in a kind of poetic, expressive way too. He brought that to the table. So Barthes was in some ways more influential than the kind of hardcore but really fascinating deconstructive intellectual practice of, say, someone like Derrida. Right?
Yeah, that's interesting. It's interesting, because I'm reading Barth's collected essays. I think it's called Image, Text, Music right now.
Image, music, text.
Yeah, and as I was reading that, I was also preparing to talk to you, and was noticing a lot of similarities in the way of kind of breaking down images and things. So I totally see that now that you say that.
Yeah, no, he was really influential in my Cranbrook days, because, like I say, the only place you could buy his books too was over in Ann Arbor, Borders Books. And now, of course, you can get any idea at all you want while you're waiting in line at Starbucks.
Right.
But back then, it was sort of hard to get access to that kind of thinking. But to pull it back more to design, I would say one thing I try to and it's also a hard sell. I try to tell students about is a lot of 19th century writers, which I actually think might possibly might in a new way resonate for the 21st century. So even though this is gonna be my pitch that never I never make a sale. Ruskin. I want people to read Ruskin, even though he's it's a slog because he writes in this awful 19th century language and everything. But what you have and what I like about Ruskin is here's a guy who's sort of first getting it and putting it all together about sort of design, aesthetics, society, history. He's like getting it, that all of these things are connected and relevant, and that you have to think about these things if you're going to make a worthwhile society, and you have to understand. So he's like the first guy who kind of like got that right and put it all together for designers. So I really think of him as really being one of the very first important design writers. So, but he's a hard slog because his writing is like torture. You know?
I've dipped my toe into Ruskin, so I will give him another chance.
Really have to work on it, but he also has some incredibly poetic ways of playing with ideas. It's a hard sale. But instead of him, the sort of easier version would be someone like Dresser. Dr. Dresser, he would call himself. He did some interesting writing. L.F. Day, another 19th century writer, someone who's kind of made it in the 20th century, but whose ideas are really still 19th century, is Louis Sullivan. I think Louis Sullivan's ideas and writing also very good. He's the cool guy who said form follows function, but he meant it very differently than how we. Right. If you read it carefully, you'll understand what he meant was a lot more inclusive and subtle than the way designers translate it. Now, if you ask most designers, they'll say that's a quote by Gropius, and they'll say that it's, blah, blah. But if you get to some of Louis Sullivan's original ideas, and those were the ideas that drove Frank Lloyd Wright, right? And that drove sort of this kind of new modern Americanism, modern American design aesthetic, really sort of came from Louis Sullivan, and Louis Sullivan was a kind of reinterpretation of kind of European ideas. So, yes, in a very long-winded way, I guess I'm saying I would try and encourage people to look into some of the early 19th century writers that were just waking up to this idea of what design was and what design thinking was in very, very sort of broad terms. And I think somehow that might actually have ways of resonating with the 21st century.
That's interesting. I know you said you've never made a sale, but I think I kind of want to give that a try, because I'm only partially familiar with some of those, so I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, they're not going to be big sellers. They're not,
right.
This is not going to catch on. This is not going to be a big wave. That no, it's not going to be a thing. Yeah. It's definitely not. But I would find that interesting, rather than say any of the sort of modernist writers and create. Out of all of the modernists, maybe one person who I think is interesting because he's sometimes crackpot is Otto Eicher's writings. His analog and digital, I find a really interesting book. It's a little bit sort of crackpotty, but he was an interesting thinker and also an interesting practitioner, because he was a very commercial. He was sort of like a sort of German Paul Rand, right? I mean, he taught and all that, but a Paul Rand who was maybe more thoughtful than our very commercial Paul Rand.
Right.
Like, my way or the highway. I guess I would look into writers like that, but I do believe in reading graphic design writers. It's too easy to say, oh well, read Tarkovsky and about his films. Yeah. It's like, oh yeah, gee, you're really, really smart. Yeah. That kind of thing is it's like, no, read graphic designers, people who are practitioners, people. I think I think that is important because that also grounds it very much in design practice. And it's like, yeah, of course, there's a million, wise guys and gals out there one could read and look at and say, you like the ideas, but it's a big jump to connect that to design. There's actually the looking closer just like was the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of good writing by designers that people just have ignored.
Yeah. Are there any, I know I said that last question was my last question, but are there any contemporary designers or design writers that you think are kind of, you're really enjoying, or you think they're kind of doing it right?
No.
Okay.
I mean, there's some who are I can't, like, once I start naming, I have to like name all of my students.
Right.
But there are people who are trying, and they have to be, such as yourself, right? Mm-hmm. So credit has to be given for people that are trying, right. But it takes a while. I mean, you're only talking to me because I wrote for 20 years. Yeah. So that's it takes a while. So to ask the question, I think there are some interesting people who are starting to write stuff, but also I'm sure there are some that I don't know of and haven't heard of.
Thank you so much for this conversation. I hope this was interesting for you also. This was really interesting for me. We've killed graphic design in a way.
Yes. But let it rest in peace. It's always some old guy who's going to say, "Now that I'm done, it's over."
Right. Right.
So it's like, what else could I say? It's like, "Oh yeah, I'm done, so it's over."
Yeah. But I really do appreciate this conversation. I really enjoyed talking to you, and so thank you so much for being a part of this.
No problem. Good luck to you.
This episode was recorded on June 8th, 2017. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts and SoundCloud and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.